Morning, church. Really, really excited to share this morning. We're going to be continuing our series on healthy habits that James kicked off last week, and perfectly up on the screen. We're going to look today at the habit of silence and solitude, which I don't know about you, but for me, this is probably one of the toughest habits to try and develop in life. So I definitely don't come with lots of answers, but we are going to be digging into Mark chapter 1, looking at what the Bible can tell us about how we can maybe work towards developing this habit in our lives. The Bible regularly encourages us to develop this habit. That's what we're going to be reading through in just a second, Mark chapter 1. So the text will come up, but if you want to have a Bible in front of you, feel free to. But beyond just Mark chapter 1, the Bible regularly encourages us to develop this habit, whether it's through the kind of poetic literature of the Psalms, the Old Testament stories of Israel, the law, through to the Gospels and how they give us examples of the life of Jesus. Regularly, time and time again, we're told to do two things that really aren't that fun: to slow down and to be still. To be quiet and to slow. And I don't know about you, but they're not my favorite things to do, especially because we've all chosen to live in a city like London. And in a city like London, silence and solitude are some of the hardest things to accomplish. And so this morning I'm speaking to myself more than anyone. I know this is one of my biggest challenges, to try and find a way of developing this habit, to prioritize it above other things that compete for my time. Because everything in this modern world is designed to keep us distracted, whether it's a city like London with so many people and advertising boards everywhere and technology in our pocket that continually keeps us distracted. It's a real challenge to then look at what the scriptures say about how we can actually say no to that and pursue silence and solitude without becoming hermits or just all of us leaving London. So it's difficult. But the scriptures have some wisdom for us. So today we'll be reading from Mark chapter 1. So we're starting in verse 9, so it will come up on the screen. I'll just read it through. Fair amount to get through. We're going to focus on the very final verse, which is Mark 1:35. But we'll read through from verse 9 just to get a bit of context of what Mark's trying to do in this chapter. So in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased." The Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. Now after John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee, proclaiming the gospel of God and saying, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel." Passing alongside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea. They were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and they followed him. And going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in their boats mending the nets. And immediately they left their nets and followed him. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him. And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. And immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons. And the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place. And there he prayed. So we're going to focus on this one verse this morning, Mark chapter 1, verse 35. I think there are four things that we can draw out from this verse, from the example of Jesus, that can shape our own habit of silence and solitude. The reason we read most of the rest of Mark chapter 1 is just because we're going to be dipping back into it. Let's look at some context of how Mark sets up this one particular verse. But here are the four things I think we can learn from this verse. Number one, solitude is of primary importance. Number two, solitude requires sacrifice. Number three, solitude is active, not passive. And then number four, solitude is a practice of communion. These are four things that Jesus shows in his habit of silence and solitude. And I think four things that we can take as practical tools for our own practice. And we're going to unpack those this morning. So the first thing that Mark chapter 1 teaches us is that for Jesus, silence and solitude is of primary importance. It is on page 1 of Mark's gospel that we read of Jesus retreating to a place of solitude in order to spend time with his Father. We don't have to read much into what Mark says before we come across Jesus pursuing silence and solitude. We see right from the start of the gospel that this for Jesus is a priority. It's not a last resort, it's the first priority that he goes to in a time of busyness. And in the Gospels, Jesus often oscillates between time of busyness with community and then times of silence and solitude. We'll read of him regularly speaking to great crowds of people and then retreating to a place of a solitary place, a wilderness place. And this is particularly clear in Mark's Gospel, in the chapter we just read, where we just have this description of the busyness of Jesus' ministry. Mark's opening chapter, it's like you kind of have to come up for air when you're reading it because it's just so busy with information and details about what Jesus is up to. And this busyness of Jesus' ministry, the urgency of his mission is kind of built into this first chapter. I don't know if you realize when we read it, chapter 1, verse 15, that famous quote, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand." There's this urgency right from the start of Mark's gospel that Jesus' ministry has begun, and it's urgent, and it's busy, and there's lots to do. And Mark opens with this. So there are four Gospels in the New Testament. Matthew and Luke begin their Gospels with genealogies. So they trace Jesus' bloodline back to illustrate a certain heritage. For Matthew, the Jewish Gospel, he's showing how Jesus is the Messiah, the one that the Jewish scriptures prophesied. Luke does a similar thing with a slightly different theological angle. John, he goes even further back. He starts with the creation of the world. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But Mark begins with Jesus as an adult. Straight into it, Jesus appears on the scene, Jesus from Nazareth, baptized by John, and he jumps straight into it, the busyness of Jesus' ministry. He doesn't have time for the nativity or anything like that. Jesus getting lost in the synagogue. So I wonder if you noticed it. I'm going to pull up on the screen some examples of where Mark uses this one particular word time and time again in the first chapter. It's the word immediately. And when you notice it, you can't miss it. Mark builds this sense of busyness with this word immediately. At the baptism of Jesus, when Jesus comes out of the water, he immediately sees the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending. Then as soon as God speaks at this baptism, the Spirit immediately drives Jesus out into the wilderness. When he comes back from the wilderness, he calls Simon and Andrew to be his disciples, and they immediately leave their nets and follow him. And then he immediately goes on to call James and John, who drop their nets and follow him. He then immediately goes into the synagogue in Capernaum. See, it's tiring just saying it. And then immediately a man appears with an unclean spirit who he heals. And then Mark says that Jesus leaves the synagogue, and immediately a man appears. He enters the house of Simon and Andrew, and they in turn immediately tell Jesus about Simon's ill mother-in-law. So Jesus heals them, and then he spends the evening healing many more. Immediately. When you read it with this lens and you see this word popping out, you just realize how busy Jesus was. And this is just one day of Jesus' ministry, because it goes from morning till evening. At the bottom will come up the Greek term for immediately, which is the word eutheos. And this is the word that Mark uses, because he would have written in Greek, and it means without hesitation or delay. And it comes from an adjective, euthus, which means straight, which basically means straight away. So what Mark is saying is that Jesus straight away went from one thing to the next, without hesitation or delay, no time intervening. And I think what Mark's trying to do here is make it clear that Jesus is pretty busy. There's not much time for him to pause or rest. It's one event to the next. You know, as I said, I get tired just reading this chapter. You can only imagine what it was like for Jesus to live it. And it is quite remarkable when you see how Jesus went about his ministry. But to be honest with you, I don't know. I kind of read that and I kind of think actually that sometimes feels like my life in London. Lots of immediatelys. If I was to kind of go through what my Monday looks like, it probably would be a lot of immediatelys. London's a busy city. We live in days of immediatelys, where one thing happens after another, where we just don't have enough time in the day to do everything we want to do. And I think this is really encouraging, because it shows that Jesus also experienced a similar thing. Jesus didn't just live kind of as a hermit in the desert. He knows what it's like to be busy, to have an urgent life, to live in a time of extreme busyness where you have to prioritize your time. You have to structure things in a way that makes sense. So Jesus experienced a life where he moved from one thing to the next. And the question that should be on our lips at this point is, well, what does he do next? What's Jesus' answer to this busyness? Does he run away from his busy schedule and leave Capernaum and just go and live in the wilderness? No. Does he just bury his head in the sand and just ignore it? Do we see Jesus engaging in habits of escapism just to get his mind off the busyness? No. We see in Mark 1:35, if we just pull up that verse again, this is Jesus' response to his busyness. Rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. So Jesus' response to a time of extreme busyness, opportunity, productivity, popularity, is different to what you and I do. Because when you and I are busy, when we have a time of busyness, what's the first thing that goes? Silence, solitude, time with God, prayer. Or at least that's for me. That's the first thing that goes when I'm busy. It's squeezed out of my life. But with Jesus, the busier he gets, the more he prays. And in case we miss it in Mark chapter 1, Mark repeats this in chapter 6 and chapter 14. So Mark 6, we don't have the time to read it, but in Mark 6, Mark describes Jesus sending out his disciples and feeding the 5,000. Huge miracles, huge events in his ministry. And what does he do in response to that? He retreats to a solitary place for a time of silence and solitude. In Mark 14, after the Last Supper, when Jesus knew he was to be betrayed, busy time in his life, what does he do? He retreats and spends time with his Father. So Mark's making it abundantly clear, both here and throughout the rest of his gospel, that for Jesus, solitude is to be a first priority, to be of primary importance, not a last resort. Second thing I think we can learn from this verse is that solitude requires sacrifice. Let's just look at the first few words of this verse, Mark chapter 1:35. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed. So as we've seen, Jesus is busy. Mark's making it really clear. It's like he's making it really clear to his readers so you can't miss it. Jesus is having a busy day. Lots of immediately is one thing happening after another. He's gone from being tempted in the wilderness to preaching in Galilee, to calling the first disciples, to going into the synagogue, to teach, to then healing a man with an unclean spirit, and healing Simon's mother-in-law, spending the evening healing everyone else who was brought to him. And it must have been tempting for Jesus to prioritize sleep at this point. And I know that would probably be my first priority after a busy day. I'd probably find a way of justifying having a really nice lie-in. Maybe Jesus was tempted to take a couple of days off work, kind of say, I'm going to pause my ministry for a little bit. But we see in verse 36 onwards that Jesus knew that when the sun would rise, there would be more people to minister to. There would be more time pressures, more people coming to see him. So what's his response? He rises early and he departs. And this is a huge sacrifice. It's both a sacrifice of his time, but also a sacrifice of his sleep. He's sacrificing rest, knowing that after this day of really intense excitement, with his ministry arriving on earth, God's kingdom starting to expand, miracles coming about, he knows what he needs is a sense of God-given sense of direction and inner strength. And we see it built into this passage that for Mark, the assumption is that Jesus believed that his internal relationship with the Father was of supreme importance to the point where it had to overtake other things. There had to be things that he sacrificed in order to pursue that relationship. And he knew that he couldn't get guaranteed distraction-free time without sacrificing on some things. So he didn't just rise, but he departed. He got out of the house. At the time when Jesus' ministry base was in Capernaum, Capernaum had a population of 1,500 people. A lot less than London. And Jesus also had a lot fewer distractions. No push notifications, no mobile devices, no one calling you, no one getting in touch on WhatsApp, anything like that. But Jesus knew he had to make sacrifices even in that environment. So for us, if you multiply that by so much, we think about our life here where we are living in 21st century London in a city of close to 9 million people with distractions everywhere around us. I think we can learn a lot from this example and think actually if Jesus needed to make sacrifices, then maybe our own habit of silence and solitude has to require sacrifice as well. And probably more than what we think. And for everyone, that sacrifice is going to look different. For some, it's going to look like sacrificing time, maybe like Jesus rising early in the morning, maybe even rising while it's still dark. Maybe it looks like taking a day a month to go out of the city, somewhere quiet, a retreat center, taking some time away from technology perhaps. Maybe just in our own lives, sacrificing technology for a day or turning devices off at a certain time. Maybe going paper Bible over digital. I don't know about you, but I've occasionally sat down in the morning to read my digital Bible on YouVersion and someone sends me a funny TikTok and then I'm on a TikTok journey or whatever it might be. Don't judge me too much. Paper Bibles are often good. Maybe your sacrifice involves you getting out of the house or practicing Sabbath, something like that. Everyone's sacrifice is going to be different. And that's particularly true when we all have different circumstances, different jobs, different constraints on our time. Some people have kids, some people have different work hours. But the encouraging thing for me is Mark doesn't actually tell us what we need to be sacrificing. I don't think that's really the point. He's not trying to show that we have to sacrifice certain things and tick it off like a tick box. But what he is showing is why we should sacrifice. And it's about quietening the external noise, quietening the internal noise, and finding time with God. Making sure that what should be our first priority isn't squeezed out by others. So it requires sacrifice. The third thing I think we can learn from this passage is that solitude is active and not passive. I've underlined there 4 active verbs that Jesus engaged in his pursuit of silence and solitude. Developing this practice of silence and solitude isn't going to happen naturally. It's not just going to come about. It's very unnatural as humans to want to slow down and stop and spend time with God. Our whole world, as we talked about, is designed to keep us distracted. There's lots of money and distraction. We live in a city where you can do whatever you want, whenever you want. If you're bored on a Friday evening and you want to go and taste any cuisine in the world, in London you can find it. If you want to do any activity in the world, you can find it. We live in this city where seeking silence and solitude can be really, really challenging. But knowing that it's not going to occur naturally, knowing that we can't just be passive, it should be a challenge, but it should also encourage us, because we see from the example of Jesus that really simple actions can really help. And Mark shows us that this through his words. It says Jesus rises, he departs, he goes out, and he prays. And each of these four actions is a decision that Jesus takes. He chooses to rise early. That's a choice that some of us want to make, some of us have to make when it comes to our own lives. But think about it. Jesus makes that choice to rise early. He had the choice of whether to do that or to have a lion. He chose to depart, to go out of the house. He chooses to go out to a desolate place, and he chooses to also pray. Our own habit of solitude is going to require action. And again, just like with sacrifice, that action that we need to pursue is going to look different for each of us. We all have different things that we consider helpful for our own walk with God. For some of us, action means getting up early. It means getting out of the house, going to a different room, perhaps. For others, action means having a certain time each morning where you just know that's going to be your active decision to pursue God at a certain time. But ultimately, it's about being proactive and not reactive. And I think the most important things in our lives we're proactive about. You don't just let really important birthdays just happen. You plan for them. You go out and buy a present. You write a card. You wrap the present. You deliver it because it's important to you. You don't just let friendships happen. You don't just think, oh, this friendship with this person, especially in London, you can't let it happen because life's too busy. You plan. You put things in the calendar. You organize catch-up so that you invest in that friendship. You don't just let your career happen. You turn up. You work hard. You go above and beyond. The important things that we value, we're proactive about. And so if this habit is going to be a habit that should be of supreme importance for us, we need to be proactive about it. And it is really challenging. And it's not going to be plain sailing. But one thing we can learn from Jesus is that there are tangible things we can do to turn it from a passive practice to an active one. Final thing I think we can learn from this verse is that solitude is a practice of communion. And I think this is probably gets to the heart of what Mark is trying to say in this verse. Solitude is more than simply going somewhere on your own. If it were, Jesus would have simply gone to the solitary place and sat there. But it's more than that. It's also more than just pursuing mindfulness and meditation. Because if it was just about mindfulness, those four words that I've highlighted there at the end, they wouldn't be there. But Mark specifically includes them because he wants to make it really clear that the purpose of Jesus' solitude was communion. It's about connecting with God. Jesus went to the solitary place, and there he prayed. Again, we're not told exactly what Jesus prayed. We're not given a formula, which I think shows us that for Mark, the important thing that he's aiming to communicate is not the content of Jesus' prayer, but the heart behind it, the reason for the solitude. So why would we spend so much time and energy putting into practice actions and sacrifices for this habit? Well, it's so that we get to that goal of communing with God in prayer. Because sometimes we need that silence to do so. There was an American Methodist missionary and theologian called E. Stanley Jones who once described prayer as time exposure of the soul to God. And he used the analogy of his life being like on a photographic plate, where as the more and more it's exposed to God, the more it progressively bore the image of God. And he said the soul, the more we can expose it to the presence of God, the more we will reflect the image of God. And I think that's a really nice image because here in Mark 1:35, we see Jesus doing exactly that, exposing his soul to his Father in an intentional way, even when he didn't need to. Colossians 2:9 says, in Christ, all the fullness of deity dwells bodily. Jesus did not require any more of the presence of God. Yet, in prayer, he went to God demonstrating his need of the Father. In his humanity, he went to God in humility and said, in order to achieve what you have called me to do, I must pursue this habit and be dependent on you. So I guess the challenge is if Jesus, the incarnate Son of God, who had the fullness of God dwell in him fully, if he prayed in order to live a godly life, full of power and full of the Spirit, then maybe we should be too. The reality is, sometimes we do need silence in order to hear. And I don't know about you, but I've tried doing my quiet time on a bus or on the tube or something like that, and it's fine, reading my verse of the day and ticking it off and going on with my day. It's fine, but there's nothing that replaces just absolute silence and dwelling in the presence of God. It changes things that you can't get when you are just busy and unable to pursue this habit. I did some research that I found that the quietest place on earth is an anechoic chamber. Don't even know what that means, but it sounds quiet. An anechoic chamber at Orfield Laboratories in Minnesota. And this place is so quiet that it's measured in negative decibels. And the longest anyone has ever been able to remain in this chamber is 45 minutes. And it's because when you're somewhere that quiet, your ears start to adapt and you start hearing things that you don't hear normally. So you start hearing your internal organs, your heart beating, your stomach gurgling, and your internal organs functioning. Apparently it's so uncomfortable that people can't survive in there for very long. And NASA actually send their astronauts there to train for the silence in space. Space isn't as quiet as this chamber in Minnesota, but it's so quiet that in space you can start hearing your internal organs, and it's just really uncomfortable. So astronauts need to go to this chamber to train for it. And there's a quote from the founder of this lab, Stephen Orfield, who says, "In the anechoic chamber, you become the sound." And it's true. When we go silent, we hear things that otherwise would have been drowned out from life. And I think from a biblical lens, this is what we're seeing here in Mark chapter 1. That yes, it's good to pray in the loudness and to pray corporately. But actually, it's in the silence that we start to hear the voice of God. And we heard in worship Psalm 46, starting off with that famous verse, "Be still and know that I am God." And built into this verse is this idea that sometimes we have to be still. To hear God, we have to find stillness. That in the stillness, there is this communion, and in the solitude, there's connection with God. So as we come to a close, I guess the question is, if you and I are flawed people, weak people in a busy world, in a busy city like London, how much more do we need this silence and solitude than what Jesus did 2,000 years ago? It is a challenge, but it's a challenge, I think, rooted in grace. And we can't forget that this is not a prerequisite for obtaining the love of God. If this isn't a habit we currently practice, or if it's not a habit we're currently on top of, and I put myself in that camp, it's okay. We live under the grace of God. We're not. It's not that Jesus says we must complete this in order for his love to be upon us, but rather it's saying actually our spiritual life is going to be enriched. When we are still, we come to know God more fully. And so it's actually a blessing that is given to us, not a religious requirement that is imposed upon us. It might be that you're thinking, well, I'm accomplishing so much in my busyness, it's really hard to sacrifice. And that's true. We accomplish lots of good things in our busyness. Maybe in your busyness, you're building a business, you're making more money, you're telling people about Jesus, you're raising a family. All of those things are great. But Jesus was standing in the middle of the opportunity that was going to change the world. He was standing in the beginnings of his ministry where lives were being changed and the world was being changed. Yet he still thought that prayer was too important not to let it squeeze out. So nothing is a higher priority than communing with God. And we have to wrestle with that and think about how that applies to each of us in our own lives. Just a final quote. This is from a book from Thomas Friedman, who says, his book title is "Thank You for Being Late," and it's all about wanting people to be late because it's good not to always be on time for things. Interesting book. He has a quote from a CEO who says, "When you press the pause button on a computer, it stops. But when you press the pause button on a human being, it starts. And I think that is so needed for us here in London, that for us to be truly human, for us to truly, if we think about it through a biblical lens, for us to know God fully, we sometimes have to hit pause, because it's when we hit pause we come alive. When we are still, we know that he is God. And as we read, Psalm 46 goes on to tell us who this God is. And that final verse that we heard was actually, he is the God who is with us. He is Emmanuel, God incarnate, whose presence is with us.